So before I started here, I was a ranger for 25 years. And as a forest ranger in the management system, at least in the DVC, your job is to implement the unit management plan. So the foresters are the ones that design that through a process many of you are familiar with. And then our job is just implement what that plan is. So for a long time, we were seeing the work of Dr. Chad Dawson, and it was having an impact on the DVC. We could see, as a forest ranger, we could see things start to change with the UNP process and the final product. And we were all just so delighted to see Chad come to the APA a few years ago. And Chad, I just wanted to say to you, while a few times you may have been the lone voice, maybe the lone vote a few times, but you weren't the only one thinking that way. You were voting for many of us. And many of us really appreciated your lone voice and sometimes your lone vote. So I just want to introduce everybody, Dr. Chad Dawson.
Good to be here, among other enthusiasts for the park, for information and education about the park, sharing it with others. And I want to speak in that vein tonight. It's a conversation. I'm not going to deliver a lecture. I can certainly do that. And I don't want to inundate you with information. I want to have more of a philosophical conversation. What is climate change? What can we expect as a process? And what is it going to do to the park? I'm not going to tell you exactly what it's going to do to the park because we don't know. What we can talk about is, where is this going? How can we think about it in a different way? Because we're going to have to plan and manage and steward the resources. But we have to have a mindset about how we do that. So that's what I want to talk about. It's more philosophical in a way than fact-driven, but it's based on science. So we're going to tell some science stories, but I'm not going to go deep into the data. If you want to see data about climate change, go to the United Nations Environmental Program website, and you will find tens of thousands of pages by the international panels that they've convened every year, almost every 6 months, to talk about what's going on the entire planet. They're geologists, they're hydrogeologists, they're every branch that you can find. They're weather scientists, they're upper atmosphere scientists. They're people that are getting together and trying to pool their knowledge to get a sense of where are we headed. Well, first of all, we have to figure out where are we? Because we're deeper into climate change than most of us are willing to admit, are willing to understand. And I thought I would be off the planet before it really became a problem. But no, here we are. It's deep upon us. And so we've got to understand it and think about what are we going to do or not do about it as it affects the world around us. In this case, particularly the park. So let's start with just 2 facts. One is, as we think this through, we know a couple things in common. And if we can't agree on these 2 things, we may not get too far in the conversation. The idea is that we have a couple things going on. One is that there's a lot more energy coming into the planet now than there ever used to be. And so the thing that most people think about is called, global warming. It's so much more than global warming. Global warming is just the beginning of what's happening. We're going to talk about the cascading of effects related to that. So we have to understand that the temperature changes the weather entirely, and as the weather changes, climate regimes, in other words, patterns of weather, change, and as that changes, vegetation, wildlife, and fisheries changes, and those things are all interrelated. And so we have to understand that there's not one thing going on, the whole planet is in a big shift. The second thing is that we have to understand that humans have impacted this. And if we can't accept that, we're in deep trouble, because we have to change what we're doing if we're going to affect climate change. if we're going to dampen the effects of climate change. We have a part to play in it. We have played a part in it. We can't ignore it. We can't pretend it isn't happening. It's real. Think about what you see in the newspaper. In August, the United Nations Environmental Program came out with its latest report, beginning to talk about where we're going. And they used the word catastrophe and catastrophic. Those were the words that they kept using in press conferences. A lot of people said, gee, is that kind of extreme? Not if you see the data that they see. Not if you see the worldwide phenomena that's going on. Now, a lot of us saw there was a lot of protests in Europe. I love this one person holding up this thing. There is no planet B. Right? I thought that was pretty cryptic. Took me a second to think about what that meant. There's no other alternative. We've got to deal with where we are and what we have. So we didn't have a lot of protests in this country, but it certainly was in the news. And as it was in the news, people began to see it. As it began to play in the evening news, you said, oh, this is happening, and that's happening, this is happening, that happening. Well, I happen to be a video nut. I go down that rabbit hole. I look at weather worldwide. And what I saw was that floods were happening everywhere. They're happening in China. They're happening all across Europe. They're happening in Siberia. They're happening all across North America, far greater than what we were seeing just in the hurricanes. So that was just one thing, global flooding and weather. And you'll see thousands of videos of flooding, massive, and I'll use the word, catastrophic flooding. Some of the ones I saw in China were unthinkable how deep the water was, 20 and 30 feet of water. Not something you can use any word but catastrophic with. So that sort of alerted a lot of people. But let's tell a few stories. Let's see if we can think about what we heard and what does it mean. Two examples to start here. The first one is polar bears, the iconic polar bear, right? The top of the food chain in a lot of the boreal forest in the Arctic. What's happening to it? You look at the science reports, they're drowning. Why are they drowning? They're trying to swim from ice floe to ice floe, and there's not enough ice floes. Seals can swim away. The polar bears are having trouble. They usually are short distance swimmers. They're like sprinters. They're not long distance swimmers. What else happens? They go ashore. They're interbreeding with brown bears. Never happened before. It's documented now. It's very well documented. The whole habitat's changed, so their behavior's changed. An iconic example of what's happening, fundamental change. The second one, of course, is wildfires. Very personal level. If you know anything about the news, sort of the West Coast, over 100 fires that are going on there this summer simultaneously. The son that works for the Forest Service, he's been out for over 5 weeks, working 12, 14-hour days, fighting fires. And so he sends me lots of videos of what's going on. And of course, I visited him during fires. I've been in fires after they've happened. I spent several months traveling late winter, early spring in the West, camping all over the place, talking to people. Because I'm a story guy. I want to go see what we're talking about. I want to see what it is. I don't want to get it through a reporter. I do like to read the science side of it. But I like to see what are people doing? How are they reacting to it? How are they thinking about it? Because I'm an educator. So that is something that always comes back to me. I have a sister who lives in Ashland, Oregon. Maybe you know, a couple of years ago, they had a fire that went right through Ashland. Standing 1 block from her house, there are no houses. There are flat concrete, nobody has a basement there, flat concrete slabs with a few pipes sticking up, maybe a chimney here or there, a refrigerator or a washing machine or dryer. But there's nothing else there. There's no roofs, there's no shingles, there's no walls. It's gone. They've had miles where they just barricaded these areas off. There's not a house left. Came within half a block of her house. Those kinds of things shake you up. They make it real. Example, might be a painful one to use, but COVID. I have a lot of family that work in healthcare. They don't understand why people don't accept the fact that nearly 700,000 people have died because it hasn't happened to them. I kind of find climate change is very similar. they haven't seen the evidence of it, personally seen the evidence of it, it doesn't exist. It's a story in the news. It's just something that's going on out there. Look what's going on in the news. Hurricanes. When have we seen so many Category 4 and 5 hurricanes, except in the last couple of years? Right now, we're looking at some storms that may or may not build into hurricane level, but they're certainly happening. They're happening all across the northern and southern hemisphere. They're not just happening in Florida, by the way. Floridians will tell you, oh, we're the only ones who get hurricanes. It's happening all over the planet. Look what happens in Taiwan. Look what happens along the shore of China. These things, they're called typhoons, they're everywhere. The flooding effects that are coming from these hurricanes are only one kind of flooding. Flash flooding is happening everywhere. As I said, I travel a lot, camp a lot. I was in Wisconsin a couple of weeks ago. I'm fishing on a trout stream, and I meet this farmer that we'd asked if we could fish there. So we're in what's called the driftless area, across Wisconsin. This is where the glaciers have not gone through, so there's no glacial drift, hence its name, driftless. And the valleys are very steep, but what that means is flash flooding is very dangerous there. They've had 3 500-year events in 3 months. We were standing on a stream, and the farmer said, look over your head. 15 feet over our head were driftwood trees, not little sticks, but entire trees that were caught in other trees. He said, that's why there's no way to get out here hardly, because all the bridges are gone. Because after 3 500-year events, I'm thinking we're good for 1,500 years. I'm sorry, sir, but you're not understanding statistics, okay? These events are going to become more frequent. They're terrifying to the people it happens to. His buildings were gone. His farm equipment was in the wrong place. He lost 12 acres of cornfield and now had full-grown oak trees in his cornfield, which he couldn't move with his equipment. Besides, a lot of his equipment had washed downstream. It happened that fast. These kinds of flooding events are happening all over. There's so many of them, we're not hearing about them in the news, but if you travel around, you'll see them. Spend a little time in the Southwest. So I'm telling you personal stories because I want you to see that I too need to go look at what's going on. I need to get an understanding, a real emotional, intellectual understanding of what is it we're facing. I keep coming back to that word, catastrophic. Southwest in a 20-year drought. So we went and looked at rivers, we went and looked at reservoirs, we went on the Colorado River rafting. There's water in the Colorado River, but if you look at the reservoirs on the Colorado River, you're looking downhill. It's at a very minimal capacity. They cannot keep running the amount of water that's running through the rivers. It's an unsustainable situation. You hear about it in the news, and then you don't hear about it, so it went away, right? It must have rained there. No. It's getting worse by the week, by the month. It's been going on for 20 years. Desertification is spreading in the Southwest. You don't hear a lot about it, but agriculture is starting to be impacted. There are farms that have gone out of business, orchards that were no longer getting any water, where the trees had already died, and you're just driving along the road. If you want to witness this, it's out there. You have to look for it. All right, so enough about catastrophic. Let's start thinking about consequences. So all this is going on, and it would seem at first that we're talking about flooding, fires, and desertification. I'm not saying desertification. That's me after a big meal, 2 or 3 desserts. No, I'm talking about desertification. The loss of a lot of vegetation that's in arid and semi-arid areas where they're turning to desert around the world. So consequences. There's so many consequences. This is just a partial list. This is reading the scientific literature and again, trying to get that 5,000, 50,000, 100,000 foot view of what's going on, because that's how my brain works. I'm a planner and an educator and a scientist, and so I keep looking for the patterns. I keep trying to find What is the commonality? What can we learn from this? So you begin to look at the literature and you see a whole bunch of things. I won't read the whole thing, but I already mentioned changes in weather regimes. Weather regimes are the patterns that normally create suitable habitats for certain kinds of vegetation, so certain kinds of forests. The boreal forest to the north relies on certain weather patterns, and that forest also helps sustain that weather pattern. There's a give and take going on there. We talked about storm events and flooding. Certainly there are lots of changes that are coming in forests. We'll give a couple of examples of that in a little bit, but it's not necessarily the direct impact of temperature or flooding. It can be what I'm going to call cascading of events. It could change the life of insects. It could change the life of fungus and its distribution. It could change where root rot happens or doesn't happen. And that affects the forest. So it's not something we can always point to in these headlines that I'm giving you. We start to have this cascade that we have to pay attention to the fact that it's going on. I defy anybody to drive any road anywhere in the United States and not see a lot of dead and dying trees. Just look. It's not something we used to see. There was always some decline going on. There was always some infestation of defoliating insects, but not to the degree we're seeing it now. You can look at the Forest Service data on mortality and you can see these kinds of patterns. And there are reasons for it, and as scientists they can point to them. But one of the things that keeps coming back to, it could be one of the cascading events from climate change. We're going to give you some examples of that. So sustainability of ecosystems begins to come into question. Can we maintain some of the ecosystems we have that we've come to accept as being common? And the answer is no. It's not the answer we want to give, but we're going to explain why that is. We'll talk again about this idea of cascading events. And then I'll tell you some stories. So, in the western United States, over the last 20 years, the cascading of events has been insect infestations in the west, causing high mortality in coniferous trees from California through northern Alaska. Things that have never happened before. And why did that come to be? Well, as climate change came along, insects were not being killed off in the northern extremes because there wasn't a hard freeze that was at the beginning of winter. Winter came gradually. It came later, and it came more gradually. And insects have this incredible ability to shed water from their bodies once they get triggered to do that, and therefore they don't freeze, because if they freeze with water in their body, crystalline structure from the water is going to pierce their body and they're going to die. This wasn't happening. And so as climate change came, these beetle infestations, and there's several species, that moved their way northward at an alarming rate all the way to Alaska. Originally it was never predicted to do that, but it happened. Hundreds of millions of acres were affected, either in patching or in wholesale losses of forest stands. So that was one of the first precursors to what's going on. That was the beginning of a cascade. Okay, this one here. Here we go. So then came the fires. Why were there fires? Well, remember all this beetle-killed material? The forest products industry tried to use it. They were using even degrading beetle-killed material in what was called blue stained wood for a long period of time, trying to use it up. They were trying to use it in chipboarding, but eventually it was so decayed because fungus gets in following beetles, and the wood begins to decay. So we're left with all this decaying material. It's falling down, and we were suppressing all fires. So what do? We're getting a fuel wood buildup that is going to be, keep coming back to this word, catastrophic, that they can't stop it. Many of the fires that started 3 months ago in California and many places in the West are still burning. Some of them have swirled by changes in weather regimes that they're turning back on themselves, and they can't be stopped. The Dixie Fire, for example, and several of the others in California have been going on for a long period of time. Again, the cascade goes on. So the next part of it is the fires themselves. One of the things that foresters love to point to is that trees, shrubbery, any woody stem vegetation sequesters carbon. It's a carbon sink. So in the carbon cycle, it's used up by the growth of those trees. It's captured, it's taken out of the atmosphere, out of the carbon cycle that comes into the water, the air, and the soil through the trees, growing, decaying, returning it, and so forth. So it becomes a carbon sink. We call it sequestering carbon. But what happens when you have dead and decaying trees and they catch on fire? That's carbon going back into the atmosphere. We captured it, but now it's going back in the atmosphere. And these fires are beginning to push climate change. They're massive. They're going up into the stratosphere. They're not just, this is one small fire. And you can see in this dramatic photo, and we were getting smoke on the East Coast that was coming from fires on the West Coast this summer. We had smog alerts all the way into Boston and New York City. Smog alerts from fires that were happening in the West. They were circling the planet. They can be seen by satellites. Again, this is the cascading of what's going on. It's not one thing. I'll give you another example. Greenland. Flown over Greenland, I had the good fortune to spend some time there, to fly over these areas, to look at the glaciers, see parts of the polar ice cap, and now it's melting. In the last couple of weeks, it has been raining in Greenland at the summits of some of these mountains. Unheard of. Unheard of. So what's coming then? You say, well, okay. Sea level rise. Yeah, there's sea level rise. It's definitely out there. It's already affecting our coast. We have reports from the EPA of already in Rhode Island, which has a low coastal area, where the lower income mass housing is, it's being flooded out at high tides because sea level has risen just enough to overcome what had been small barriers to water intrusion into these areas. So sea level change is there, but there's something far worse than that, something more sinister going on. It doesn't immediately occur to you until you read the research reports. So we're melting these ice caps, we're melting these glaciers, and you can go look at tidewater glaciers like this that used to extend out into the ocean. You go to Alaska and go to tidewater glacier cruise, and some places you can't see the glaciers anymore because they've retreated so far up the valleys. There are visitor centers that are so far from the glaciers, they were built right at the glacier where it hit the tidewater line, and it's 10 miles back up around the corner. You can't even see the glacier anymore from some of these visitor centers. It's happening. What's the more sinister part of it? It's a little hard to understand, but here's what's going on. I need my little pointer here if I can figure it out. So let's think about, okay, here's Greenland. We got a polar area up here. This is the Gulf Stream. The Gulf Stream. What does the Gulf Stream do? It's part of the whole flow of ocean currents that affect fisheries, that affect the migration of large sea mammals, whales, and so forth. When the ice cap melts and Greenland melts, it dumps a lot of fresh water into the ocean at the same time. It changes the salinity and therefore the density of the ocean water. It doesn't sound so bad, right? It's less salty, right? That disrupts the Gulf Stream flow. What happens when it disturbs the Gulf Stream flow? It changes weather patterns. So what's happening in Europe now, you can go look this up, they're having incredible changes with cloudy weather, a lot of overcast weather, a lot of rain, and a lot of flooding. Projection, it's going to continue. But while that's happening, because these currents are going on, while these currents are going on, so that's affecting northern Europe. What's happening is these currents come down, they've dumped all of their moisture up here, and there's none left down here. So the same thing that was happening this winter in the Mediterranean was that they weren't getting the rains. They were getting very hot, dry, sunny weather, which is very bad for North Africa. Talking about desertification, it's starting to show that there's a lot of increase in desertification and in less rainfall and higher temperatures, higher mean temperatures, higher weather events. So again, this is a cascading factor that's going on. It's going to change fisheries. It's going to change a lot of things. We're in the northern forest. This is a Forest Service slide that they like to use. This is a northern forest region of the Forest Service. Now, if you look at the state lines here, you'll see that the Ozarks are in this. A lot of people working in forestry wouldn't say that the Ozarks are part of the northern forest, that northern deciduous coniferous forest that extends from northern Minnesota through the Great Lakes all the way up to Maine. So what stands out here? What jumps out? You know, you gotta always look at home. It's kind of like when you see a family photograph, you always look at yourself and make sure you're smiling, you look pretty good, right? Well, when we look at this, we gotta think of ourselves as New Yorkers and think of ourselves as being in the Adirondacks. What's very evident here is the Adirondacks is the largest unbroken block of forest outside of some of the areas of Maine, some of the areas of the North Forest, but it's the only private and public park in the region. So the Adirondacks are really important. Let's drill down a little farther here. So notice some of the statistics the Forest Service would put out. 42% of the land is forested. That's unusual in the United States. 32% of it is timberland, and that's merchantable forests according to the Forest Service and their inventory processes. And 41% of the U.S. population lives in this region. You can see conflict coming with those statistics. I'm sure you're all familiar with the map of the Adirondacks. And now we look and see that we've got two different colors there. We've got wilderness and wild forest, which is going to be the rest of the subject of the evening. What's going to happen to those? What are the processes at work here? Well, some of the same ones we've already talked about. Is it going to look the same in 10 years, 30 years, 50 years, 70 years? No, not exactly. What is going to happen? Change is going to happen. The habitat is going to change. It's going to be more, sustainable for different species than some of the species that are there now. And the first going to change, wildlife, fisheries. Eventually, there'll be more invasive species. Eventually, some of our prized forests, think about hemlocks, eastern hemlocks, under a great deal of stress in the eastern United States for the same reasons I expressed about the western United States. Woolly adelgid is one of the culprits there. Affects foliage on the hemlocks. It's moving its way up the East Coast. It's definitely been in New York for 5 years now. They've tried to stamp it out. We're going to come back to that as an example, but we'll come back to that story. But there's different things we can do on private lands versus public lands, and that's going to become important in this philosophical look at what can we or should we do about climate change in the Adirondacks. If you were trained in ESF and resource management or forest management, you immediately think, what can we do? What kinds of interventions, what kind of manipulations, what kind of really direct management things can we do? And the list is very long. The list is very long. And the students who've been there think about them immediately. They begin to think, we can do this, we can change these conditions. We can do what was done in the Carolinas. Think about this woolly adelgid coming through. It's killing all of the hemlock, the eastern hemlock, particularly the Carolina subspecies of the eastern hemlock. So one of the things the Forest Service decided to do was say, okay, if it's going to kill everything, here's our strategy. We're going to go in, we're going to create these islands that we want to survive. So we're going to spray these islands, which we're going to select. We're going to keep the woolly adelgid population out of that, and we're going to let everything around it die off. And we're going to create these islands, which we can then manage for the next 10 or 20 years. And when woolly adelgid is gone, because they've killed off all the hemlocks around, then we'll be able to reseed it with these islands that we've created. We started that 10 years ago. So far the data is kind of mixed. Is this working or not? What's a problem is a lot of the hemlocks are hanging on. They're half dead, they're not all dead. Think about what happened to American elm, what happened to chestnuts. Up to a few years ago, I could still find chestnut trees around. I could still find elm trees around that were isolated from the other ones. And the problem was, they still were fighting that disease, and therefore they were incubating that disease, and so it hadn't died out. And when had chestnuts left the forest up here? 80 years ago? 100 years ago? And there's still that residual. So this may or may not be an approach that we can take. But that's what foresters think about. Why? Because we're problem solvers. And that is both good and bad. And when it comes to climate change, it might be a very bad thing. And that's going to be the subject of where I'm going to try and go with this. So what can we do? Well, in the private lands, we can do everything that's available to us. We can spray, we can change our harvesting techniques and take out, think of emerald ash borers. We have a glut in the market of ash trees now because emerald ash borers are really devastating for us everywhere. Not as much in the Adirondacks as it is coming up from the southern tier through the Catskills, but it's starting to really seriously affect the Adirondacks as well. So we can spray, we can go in and heavily harvest it, again, trying to knock down the host for these insects that are coming and reproducing at a phenomenal rate, anything beyond what we imagine they would. But there's others coming as well. I could go through a long list that forest pathologists could tell you about. So species composition is changing. Think of the beach and all the things that are happening to beach over time. Maple decline, it is definitely changing. So we can do a lot of things. We can manage the forest so that we don't have fires as we have more trees dying. We've often thought of the Adirondacks as the asbestos forest. In other words, it wasn't going to burn because we had enough moist ground conditions. We didn't have the fuel loads buildup that happened in the West. We didn't have the dry atmosphere that they have in the West. Some of that may change. What can we do in the forest reserve? Well, we're going to use the word stewardship. That's the DEC's word for it. I think it's a good word. It's trying to be lighter-handed in managing, manipulating, intervening, and so forth, and trying to more control things from the outside that can permeate into the interior, whether it's invasive species on roadsides, whether it's road salt, whether it's what people do or the equipment or activities they can do in the forest. So it's been a much more light-handed approach to it. And all of those kinds of things can go on. But the questions are being raised now, much like it has been at the federal level, on federal lands. How far should we go? How far should we go? Before we go in to answer that question, let's look at a couple of things that are going on. I'm going to come back to that question because it's the question of the night. It's the take-home message. How far should we go? There's so many values for wild forests, benefits and values for wild forests. They sequester carbon, they give us clean water, clean air. They do a lot of things that we protect the forest reserve for. That's the point of the forest reserve. It does provide, and I'm not going to read all these, it is an opportunity for future generations to decide what to do. It's an environmental science laboratory to understand what the changes are and what the changes are if we don't manipulate them. That's one of the arch problems we have right now is we think we know what we're doing, but we may or may not know what we're doing when we intervene, when we manipulate. So how are we going to maintain some of these values and benefits if we manage it too intensively? We'll lose some of these properties. We can still provide recreation. We'll still have some scenic beauty and opportunities for inspiration and education, but we'll have lost the environmental baseline on which we can begin to compare everything. And if you look back over 50 years, why we have the forest reserve, that is one of the most important reasons, in addition to clean water, clean air. All those ecological services, that was some of the thought process back when there was a constitutional article, what's now Article 14 in the Constitution to protect the forest reserve, was mostly water quantity and quality. It's now a lot of these other things as well. It does provide some economic opportunities. It keeps communities going in the Adirondacks. So we have to think of this as what we're trying to still have these values and benefits. So sometimes that drives us to try more intensive management to continue to have them. But what are the policy and planning frameworks we have to work with? I'm going to highlight these. These are certainly Article 14. We always come back to this wild forest lands. I'm not going to read the whole article. The article is way longer than 2 sentences that the courts fight over. It's actually quite elaborate what it rolls out as policy of how the forest reserve is to be managed. But we always go back to this wild forest wording. And we want to emphasize the wild forest. We're going to come back to that. In the State Land Master Plan for the Adirondack Park, whether we're talking about wild forests, whether we're talking about wilderness, again, we come back to this wild character, wildness. What's interesting in the wilderness, it doesn't talk as much about wild. It talks about primeval character. It talks about a whole lot of things, no human habitation, no human impacts and so forth. But it says, look at this word, which is protected and managed so as to preserve, enhance, and restore, where necessary, its natural conditions. Why is there a different wording on those two things? This is the crux of what we have to deal with when we talk about what is the future going to be and what should we do about it, because that's the policy and planning framework we have, and we're stuck with it in a certain way. So let's try and investigate what that means. So what's wildness? So this has been talked about a lot, it's been debated, it's in the federal courts about it, certainly the New York State courts have attacked it. And really what it is the idea that human impacts do not affect natural processes. That's going to be my emphasis, natural processes. That evolutionary processes, ecological processes are allowed to continue. Wild, when we talk about our grandchildren, right? We say, oh, that's a wild child. What does that mean? It's they're self-willed. That's what wild means, self-willed. And if we think of wild in that regard, it means that that evolutionary and ecological process does what it needs to do as a process, and that human intervention of it reduces the wildness. And the word in the act is, it's trembling. It's a funny word. It's not trembling, it's trembling. In other words, human impacts have hit upon it. If we go to naturalness, the definition for naturalness talks about that we have affected it as humans, the natural conditions, the characteristics or attributes, whatever it is, the kind of forest, the composition, what kind of fish we have in our ponds, that it's free from those human influences to the effect that it doesn't affect those attributes or conditions. And so we're talking about natural conditions. And so if it's untrammeled, those conditions remain the same. If we trammel them, we're going to manipulate them, manage them. We're going to put and take brook trout. We're going to rope a pond. We're going to restore the pond. We're going to take out the warm water fisheries, and we're going to put back in the cold water fisheries, heritage strain brook trout, and we're going to try and maintain that. Okay? That's a heavy manipulation of something. That is definitely trammeling. It's trying to restore the natural conditions, but it's definitely affecting the processes because the water is warming and maintaining that fishery is going to get more and more difficult. Okay, so how much do we have to intervene to create the natural conditions? This is a huge debate at the national level. There's 4 federal land managing agencies, and they're in a tremendous battle over whether we're producing natural conditions, whether or not they're going to be sustainable, or whether we're going to allow evolutionary processes to continue. Because evolutionary processes aren't going to necessarily maintain natural conditions. We may not have hemlock in 10 or 20 years. We may not have brook trout in a lot of places in 20 or 30 years if groundwater continues to warm. So, okay. So we've got these processes. And the classic is, evolutionary process is, doesn't matter if you're an animal, plant, insect, a tree, whatever it is. What is the role? Adapt, migrate, or die. Pretty brutal, isn't it? Evolutionary processes don't care what we benefit and value as humans. It will have vegetation, it will have animal life, it will have wildlife there. It may not be the ones that were in the historic range of variation. Historically, what we found there was always some variation. It may be quite outside that. And it may never go back to what was there historically. We're going to have to live with that. So things are changing, and let's look at one of the predictions. This is going back to 2007. I took this out of a scientific report just to give you an idea what the scientists are talking about when you start reading. Tens of thousands of articles are out there. I'll go back to the United Nations Environmental Program is the only organization that's trying to bring this all together in these interdisciplinary panels, hundreds of people that keep bringing together for long periods of time to try and see what does the literature tell us. Okay, so here we are in the Adirondacks, 2007, and this is the prediction. So you can vaguely make this out, and it's intentionally not trying to give you a very detailed view. What it's saying is, this is the current forest types, and we can argue about this. So we've got Pennsylvania, New York, obviously New England here up to Maine. What happens in, remember we're talking about forest types. How long does it take a forest type to change? Trees don't send out too much seed. If they're wind dispersed, a little more than others. Wildlife movement. Aquatic systems respond much faster than terrestrial systems. So a lot of these are projected out 50 to 80 years. So the first example here is under a low emission scenario. We were pretty optimistic back in 2007. These particular people said, oh, it's going to look like that, which isn't a whole lot different from what it is now. And of course, fish and wildlife have changed radically since then. Why is the forest going to change more slowly? It just doesn't reseed itself. It doesn't move and adapt as quickly. And the idea is that we've changed the suitability. We've changed the weather regime. So we're changing rainfall. We're changing wind patterns. We're changing temperatures and when the first snow is and the last snow and so forth. And that changes what trees are going to survive in there. So think about it as suitable habitat. We're changing the suitability of the habitat for those species of trees. So they often talk about this as the trees marching north. Okay, they're not ants. They're not literally going to march north. When I'm talking to students, I have to be very careful what's reality and what's in a movie, right? So this, we've passed this already. This low emission scenario is gone. We're way beyond it. We're approaching this high emissions scenario right now, and it's not slowing down, which is disturbing. But they're projecting 50 to 80 years out that the oak hickory that's way down here, think of that as southern Pennsylvania, is going to be all the way up into the Adirondacks in 50 to 80 years. We're not going to have the mixed deciduous coniferous forest that we have now, and what we love, which historically venue. And what we have now, the speech maple, is going to be up here in northern Maine. It will have, as they talk about, it's evolutionary, moved, retreated, remember? Adapt, migrate, or die. And so that's what's going to happen if we think about these forests. But long before the forests change, fish, wildlife, insects, all that's going to change. Water temperature is going to have changed. So what can we think about as this happens? Can we maintain hemlock in the face of these kind of evolutionary changes? Probably not. Can we slow it down? Can we have it for a while? We can. But how long should we try and maintain it? How long should we maintain brook trout populations? Again, I'm not against managing some natural conditions, but we need humility. We need to recognize that these forces are way beyond our ability to contain them. And if we had paid attention, we wouldn't be in the mess we're in. But guess what? We're a bubble. The people that are here tonight, we are in a bubble. If you go out in middle America, they'd scoff at what I'm talking about. They'd say, why do you go to them? You can't change it. If it can change, why don't we do whatever we want to do? Let's make it whatever we want it to be then, right? I know researchers who are looking at changing in the Adirondacks. They're pouring hundreds of thousands of dollars into research over the years, warming soils, trying to see what will happen to trees. Oh, come on, it's going to take a long time for the forest to change, and you know, the energy industry doesn't mind you pouring millions of dollars into heating the Earth's forest floor, but you're just, in your lifetime, you're just not going to see a whole lot of change. So some of the research is speculation. It's got to be, because we cannot simulate these as experiments because of the cascading of events. So here we're moving into this area. Can we maintain the natural conditions we have right now? I say no. How far are we going to go? Let's think about that. So this is the philosophical part I want to wrap us into. So is it both natural conditions, or wildness and naturalness as we've defined it? So wildness is the processes, naturalness are the conditions. As they change, it becomes easy to identify what's going on. It becomes more obvious. But how much should we attempt to restore those conditions? How much should we create substantial interventions? Not just because of the time and money, but what are we doing? If we're going to try and use the forest reserve as an environmental baseline to understand where we're going, and so that future generations can see it as well. Again, that's one of the reasons we have the forest reserve. We shouldn't over-manipulate it, because we lose our baseline. And the forest reserve probably is one of the few baselines we're going to have in the northern forest. Because, remember the map of the northern forest? Besides the Boundary Waters Canoe Area and the Adirondack Park, those are the two largest privately held areas in which we can get an environmental baseline, by which we can begin to say, what is it that's happening? What is it that's happening? Every time we go in with heavy management actions, no matter what condition we're trying to manage, we are diminishing the wildness for sure, and probably the naturalness, but certainly the evolutionary processes. We're trying to hold them back. Again, I'm not saying we should accelerate them. There's some people who are arguing that. But I'm concerned about the attempt to fix things. Human beings have trouble restraining themselves from intervening in the natural processes. We just can't help ourselves. We're tinkerers, we're meddlers. Well, we like to say we're managers. We like to think that our science will help us figure this out. I say that there's sort of a social, cultural part of this too. There's a relationship with the environment. And if we're going to learn from it and learn how to live with it and not get in deeper in climate change than we already are, then we're going to have to listen to it. When we're talking to indigenous people, when we're talking to people who have been around too long, like myself, 73 years, it feels like more than that, but we've seen change. We've seen very dramatic change. You go back to places you were when you were a kid, you were in college, you can hardly recognize some of these places. It's completely different. So we've got this paradox. What do we allow to change? Do we allow natural processes, or do we keep going back to these natural conditions and try and manipulate them? This is something the DEC is going to have a very hard time dealing with. The APA is going to have a very hard dealing with. And last Friday, I gave a lecture, a couple you were at, in which I talked about the future of the APA, and a little bit indirectly the DEC. The idea that we've got to monitor, we've got to understand what is it that's changing, what can we do about it for the sake of communities. It doesn't matter, we're talking about water quality, we're talking about waste or sewage treatment, we're talking about diversions of water. Whatever we're talking about, we ought to know what's changing, how fast it's changing. What's road salt doing over time? It's going to change. And in some cases, it's going to add a stressor that wasn't there in our aquatic systems. Kurt Steger's going to talk tomorrow about some climate change and aquatic systems. He's going to be on a webinar at 10 o'clock. Go to the Adirondacks Research Consortium website or Clarkson University, and you can see that. And a few weeks after that, John Bartow from the New York State Forest Products Industry is going to be doing a webinar talking about what we do on private lands. And a lot of what is going to be talked about by the APA and DEC is managing natural conditions. And I'm going to argue that that could be deepening the problems and not having the humility to recognize that we're not as in control of this as we would like to be. So now I'm going to go to that final example I want to use. A famous biologist, Evolutionary, argued when they formed the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge that it should be preserved as a little portion of our planet left alone to see how nature perceives and with evolutionary processes. And that was one of the thoughts he had. But if you went to the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and you talked to the wildlife biologists, they were tearing their hair out because they were doing prescribed burns, they were trapped and transferring wildlife, fisheries, and so forth. And you wouldn't think that they would be doing that in that Arctic area, but they were. Every intervention, manipulation you could do anywhere in the continental U.S. was being done in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And so the staff began to have sort of a local insurrection, and I know some of the staff there for many decades, and they were having a real problem because their agency was saying, do everything you can. It's all about managing the natural conditions. Forget about processes. And the staff rebelled. And so they went through a long series of conversations and soul searching. And they really, at the end, came back to what Evolutionary was saying. And this is a statement from their website right now today. They've decided to reduce management activities in the face of climate change and embrace stewardship, since stewardship better conveys the idea of caring for a place. It embraces a sense of humility, restraint, and deference to the processes of the area's origin and unfolds, meaning the evolutionary processes. It's one of the few units in the federal system that's taken this direction. There are certainly staff everywhere who are talking about it, but this kind of philosophical look at it, a reverence almost, a humility certainly, to look at this and to think about what can we do and what should we do over time becomes important. It's not necessarily what we want to see. We all have a long baseline. We all go back to places which we remember fondly, which are in our heart. It's in our memory, it's in our subconscious. We remember what it was the first time we saw it, and when we go back there, there's something that stirs our emotions, and our subconscious says, this is so good to come back to this. This smells, this sights, what it looks like. And over our lifetime, forests don't change all that much. Well, they are now, and they certainly did during the time of changing American chestnut. But generally they don't. But if you like ash trees are going, where I live, almost all my ash trees are dead in Beverly Lot. It's changing. It's not the way I remember it. And that's only 15 years ago. I never saw that coming. I never saw that it would be there. And so it makes me want to go out, to go out and say, oh, can I spray it? What if I cut these trees? Because some of my trees are black ash trees. And you know what? Black ash is different from some of the others, white and green ash. Black ash is what Native Americans, and I live on the bordering in the Onondaga Nation, in Onondaga County, that's what they use historically for their culture. And one of the things I would do is systematically harvest these ash trees in a particular way, at a particular time of the year, and I would take them to the reservation, and I would give them to the cultural groups, particularly the ones that were teaching basket making, because you needed black ash splints to be able to do that. Well, that's pretty well gone, and now they've come to me and said, what other species could we use? And I'm kind of stumped. I've gone to a lot of wood products people and said, is there another species that allows you to get those splints? Are they going to have to use sweetgrass? Are they going to have to use white pine needles? What are they going to use in the future? There's a whole cultural, historic aspect that's tied to those ash trees. So I have that kind of deep feeling that I want to protect those trees. You know what? I tried, and I couldn't. And that's what began to make me think about this on a bigger scale, wanting to travel around the country, trying to understand what is it we're facing. We're facing a real philosophical challenge, a paradox. And so the words I found inspirational, last slide, is this one. Howard Seinheiser, who's the chief author, chief architect, however you want to phrase that, of the Wildness Act back in 1964. He worked on it for over 10 years, 54 to 64, before it passed. He warned us all the way back in the 1950s that we had to be careful, that wild character was the most important thing. And I love his quote, the essential quality of wilderness is wildness. Is wildness. Remember, it's those processes. So I think, this is my feeling, that the legacy of the Forest Reserve in the Adirondacks is at a pivotal point in its history. How much are we going to try and be stewards? Be stewards, in other words, honor those natural processes as well as minimize how much we affect the natural conditions, and just honor the fact that it's changing. It's changing. It will have something growing there as life goes on. You know, the idea that we were brought up in biology 101 in high school to the phrase at that time, it was going back to the 1950s, I'm sorry to say, that nature abhors a vacuum. Something will live there. Something will change. It will adapt that area, adapt to that area. So restraint. And finally get to the final thing that Howard Seinheiser talked about, the purpose of wilderness stewards. And again, he's saying these things in the 1950s and the early 1960s. He talks about wilderness stewards must be guardians, not gardeners. And again, he's making a distinction between allowing natural processes to evolve and not trying to maintain all natural conditions. And so that's the paradox we're left with. Not many people are thinking about this or talking about this, but to me, this is at the root of when we look at the effects of climate change, as we look at the consequences and those cascading things, we want to stick our fingers in it, stick our thumb in that dike, and think we can stop it. Well, we can change some of it. We can hold it off for a period of time, but it will change. What we put in motion, there's so much energy that's being added to the global system, it's going to change things. And we talk about 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, and we're like, 1.5 degrees, I don't even notice that much. I can't even tell what the temperature is. It's like, no. It's talking about that significant of a change in energy being added to the global systems. And it affects everything in our climate. It affects everything that's going on. And we talk about the cascade. How much are we going to pay attention to the differences between those two things? It's become a passion of mine as I've seen it. It's the common thing that I keep coming back to as I traveled around the United States in the last couple of years, looking at these global changes and trying to personally come to grips, whether it's in my backyard, my woodlot, or what I see around the country. It's a paradox, and I think we have to embrace it, and it will make it easier when we hear about changes that DEC wants to make, or policy the EPA wants to do, or what EPA is doing, or the Forest Service is doing, to think about what are the potential impacts of that policy, of that plan, of those management activities. And with that, if you want to entertain any questions, comments, not too long to comment. Anybody want to engage that? Yes?
Do you make any distinction then between management, stewardship, preservation, or protection of
Yeah,
lands?
I would say, as I pointed out in that one slide, I use the difference between private lands in the Adirondacks are open and will be actively managed. And I know John Bartow, and when he talks in his webinar, he's going to talk about how forestry allows you to sequester carbon, harvest it, move it into furniture, buildings, and so forth, and keep it sequestered, and then grow more and get more sequestration in new growth and so forth. And he has a point. He has a point. And there is that to do in management. But stewardship, again, is looking more towards both the processes and the conditions. It's trying to understand where is this really going and how much should we intervene in that evolutionary process. Did I answer your question?
Well, I'm thinking more broadly, like in terms of what our Article 14 does in terms of protecting. What is it that we're protecting, and what measures do we take to protect what? You know, there's all this, obviously a lot of discussion about overuse and that kind of thing. And that gets back to management, so it's, how does all that fit together?
As I think I'm trying to portray it, is the whole idea of wild forest is to protect processes as well as conditions. And there's some confusion in the wilderness definition, because it talks about natural processes in the State Land Master Plan, but wild forest talks about wild character, and so those are somewhat contradictory. You almost want to flip them, but that was done in 1972. It followed what was going on in the national legislation, but it's entered into a real huge set of management problems, because management is meant to be more intervention, more manipulation, etc. Where stewardship is meant to be more light on interventions and trying to allow, again, wild, self-willed, that is doing what the processes are evolutionarily and ecologically. It's not what humans want, it's what that habitat is suitable for: fish, wildlife, plants, trees, what have you. I know this is very philosophical, but it's central to where we're going. Go ahead.
Hi. So we've had climate change. The scientists have known about climate change for about 50 years anyway, at least. And we spent, some of us have spent a lot of that time trying to fight climate change from happening. And so I'm a little bit, and don't take offense at this, but I'm a little disturbed about your position in that it feels like you've given up on preventing the climate change. You're talking about how we're going to address it, manipulate it or not. And I guess I would point out that allowing, the idea that, you're putting Sennheiser, et cetera, on evolutionary processes, and what's happening is not a natural evolutionary process. It's an unnatural evolutionary process created by humans. So you get to the same philosophical argument, I suppose, but I guess I'm just disturbed by it. I feel like you're promoting giving up, fighting climate change. We still have a chance to at least do something to make the results less onerous.
And that would be a whole different lecture that I would give related to that, because I completely agree with you. What I'm talking about, I'm trying to make the case that the Forest Preserve is in a unique position for us to use it as an environmental baseline to understand what is happening and to track, to monitor what's going on. And I'm saying it's going to be hard for us to do relatively hands-off to allow that to happen. We're going to fight climate change. We're going to protest it. We're going to do everything possible to change infrastructure and so forth. But it's going to come anyway. It's already in motion. It's already happening. Let's try and slow it down, grind it to a halt if we can, but that's decades away because it's been at least 50 years in the making, if not longer. So I'm agreeing with you, but that's a whole other conversation. I'm trying to make the case that the Forest Reserve gives us a chance to observe what's happening and to better understand what we can and can't do.
Why doesn't the rest of the northern environment do the same thing? Why is it different here? In other words, here we might have a chance of preserving something that is more like what it already is versus what we study it somewhere else.
I'm saying that we have the policy and legal to maintain as much as we can what's here, but to recognize that we can't stop it forever. And so we have to be careful not to get too many interventions and manipulations going, or we'll lose the ability to track what is changing. Because it's one of the few places it's a preserve. And that's why I'm making a distinction. I'm saying private lands are going to go out and manage as much as they can to do it. And that may or may not be good. That's a whole other argument. John Bartow and others will talk about that. And I'm not saying give up. I'm merely saying that we have to recognize there's hard decisions coming. And we have.
But what about the fact that the park could be a place where you preserve species for, you know, their seeds or whatever to move them?
We can maintain natural conditions for a period of time, but like what's happening in the Carolinas, they went to a drastic approach to do it. They completely managed this wilderness area, which was against, and this is all in court and so forth, but they tried to go in and create these islands and let this other disease come through, diligence come through and kill off all the others, with the idea for decades they would keep pouring these pesticides into these islands to protect them, so when the rest of the trees were all dead, they could maybe come back. And that's an idea. The problem is it completely changed the ecosystem all around it. In terms of animals and other things, the pesticides had a real problem with other insect populations, which were healthy insect populations before they began to push all these pesticides into it. So everything we do has a consequence, is what I'm saying. So we need to be careful. We tend to run right in and want to fix everything. We're problem solvers as a species. And I'm saying, let's try and restrain ourselves when it comes to the forest reserve, because we cannot protect it entirely like it is. We can slow it down, but we're never going to stop it.
Well, and thank you for indulging my challenge.
Absolutely, it's a great challenge, and that's the conversation we need to have. I engage that for hours at a time. Other questions, comments? Yes, sir.
So there's a 1972 state land master plan that guides both Adirondack Park Agency and the DEC in terms of their management, decision activities, policy questions, answers. Are you advocating some kind of a change to that master plan that brings us up to date with the current environmental changes that are occurring or will occur as a result of climate change?
I think the one I already pointed out was, I think the definition of wilderness needs to be tweaked. Right now it talks about that you can do anything you want to restore natural conditions. It's right in the definition of it. And I would argue that that is not appropriate, and that's the legal problem that the four federal agencies are facing, because they use the same phraseology, that anything is good. And the head of the, Mr. Jarvis, who's the head of the Park Service, said in something to the effect, everything now is not about wilderness, it's about maintaining park conditions. And that's the antithesis of what wilderness is. So his idea is, if it's in the definition, we're going to do everything we can to make sure every condition we can as it is right now. And that's one of the things I see that's going to be a problem. And so am I interested in seeing the state land master plan revised? I think in that regard, I think they have to address that. How many interventions are we going to do in the forest reserve, in wilderness? Right now, the way it's written, we're going to protect wild forests more than we protect wilderness, because that's the way the policy's written. That's sort of backwards, in my opinion. Yes?
Hi, so given your experience working with EPA and just your forestry background, what do you think the plausibility, even if you could put it into a time frame, of actually making the changes necessary to change the DEC culture in some ways to actually backing up from a management perspective and more into a stewardship ethic?
Can you ask the question a different way? Because I'm not sure I'm with you on what you're asking.
I can't hear you what you said.
Can you say it a little differently? Because I'm not understanding the germ of your question. What's the center part of your question?
I guess I'm just trying to, do you think it's actually feasible for these changes to shift from a management ethic to a stewardship ethic for forest preserve lands, particularly looking at DEC as the land manager of these forest preserves? Of the forest preserves?
Well, having had a lot of the people that are DEC employees in class at ESF over the years, I can guarantee that while we talk about stewardship, their inclination is always to go to management. And so I think it will be very difficult to get the intent of stewardship. The word is used, but to get the actual intent of stewardship into practice out there, it's going to be very difficult, just as it is in the federal agencies, because many of the men and women in those positions have gone through natural resources management programs. They didn't go through stewardship programs. They didn't go through wilderness programs. They went through management programs. And so their expertise is in manipulation and management, interventions, so forth. So that's how they were taught.
Is there recognition of that at that academic level to change that?
There is, but because the industry is a large supporter of the academic environment, it's very difficult. There's science that's going on. So there's science that's going towards stewardship more than management. But in terms of the educational paradigm, it's much more oriented towards management because it's the industry that supports a lot of the educational program and that hires the students and it wants people who think like that. And there's been a real dearth of employment in stewardship at any federal agency level for many decades. It doesn't matter who was in power in Congress or who the president was, there has not been a lot of thinking in that regard. So it's a difficult process to try and get that thinking in at the stage in which we're at a crisis, at a real pivotal point. So that's why I'm speaking out, because I say the same thing to my colleagues, I said the same thing to the administration, I said the same thing to the APA, I've said the same thing to the DEC for 25 years, and nobody wants to hear it. Now, you were all very polite. Nobody got up and left and said, boy, what a boring philosopher this guy is, right? And I'm not saying, my real last slide here. Oops. Here. Come on here. It's not going where I want it to go. Trying to get to the left. There it is. Okay, I'm not saying we're going to save the galaxy. I'm not saying that I'm Groot and Guardians of the Galaxy. Your kids all got that already, okay? But I'm not saying we're going to save the galaxy or run some crazy quest. I'm really saying the Forest Reserve offers us an opportunity to do something different. Put it in very few words, and we need to think about it. Academics is very much towards management, and that's where most of the professionals have come through. Go ahead.
So then if the tendency of the state is toward management, should we continue to add lands to the forest preserve?
Oh boy, That's a tough question. You know, we're getting this into an all-night conversation here. Because we have to decide, would it be better off if the Nature Conservancy took over that land? Would it be better off if some open space institute took over the land? Would it be better off if it was in private hands? Because in some cases, private landowners have done a far better job than the DEC has done in preserving natural processes as well as conditions. So that's a long conversation to have. I'd like to see those lands as protected as they possibly could for as long as they possibly can, because we're not making any more of it, and this is our unique opportunity to do something about it. So I would hope some good steward would come in. Is it DEC? Maybe, maybe not. Okay, I mean, I can't say they're bad, I can't say they're good, because they do both. They do both. My opinion, that's my opinion. When it comes to preservation, when it comes to stewardship, is what I'm talking about. Not everything they do. Anyone else? Yes, go ahead.
You mentioned briefly the importance of consulting indigenous groups. I'm curious if that's a priority. I mean, if you've done that, if you've witnessed that being done for the Adirondack Park, are the local indigenous groups involved in these decisions?
There are very limited interactions. A few of the environmental organizations have engaged some Native American people. I know certainly where I'm from, on the Onondaga Nation, it is a very common conversation, but I don't know how far it goes beyond that. I know in the western United States and Alaska, there is a lot of interaction between the federal agencies and indigenous peoples to talk about what is the historic range of variation, what have they seen change, living on the land and living a subsistence lifestyle in particular, what are their experiences. They have managed the land. They've done a lot of interventions. In some places they have not. And we can go Mission Mountains Wilderness and I can't think of the name of the tribe. I think it's the Flathead tribe on the other side of that range with their grizzly bear habitat. They have a grizzly bear reserve because it's considered a sacred spirit animal. You go there, you're going to see grizzly bears, okay, in Montana. And they have thought that through very carefully. They know the habitat, they know the range, and they have some remarkable insights. Are we taking advantage of it? No, we're not. We're not. As much as we could. As much as we could learn from it. Alaska, they've done a lot more because they didn't know a lot about what was going on in the Arctic. And so those people who live so close to the land have had some very important observations to share. And it's been very helpful. Anyone else? One last question? You want to go? Yes, go ahead.
So I'm sort of wondering if it's a priority in further management or stewardship to preserve the ability of our forests to sequester carbon, because I know that certain forest management actions that we take can help facilitate the forest abilities to sequester carbon, so I'm wondering if that is a priority in further management as well.
Absolutely, and listen to John Bartel when he does his webinar here late October, and he'll tell you all about what private industry is doing related to that. Again, the idea, you sequester carbon into the woody biomass, and you harvest it and use it, and it stays locked up. You get all kinds of woody biomass around us, right? Wood products, and then you go grow more. And so that's private industry's take on it. Certainly, we lock until there's a fire, until there's deterioration through beetles and decay in trees, that's when that carbon's being released again, and that's a problem. So yes, there are techniques, there are management approaches on both public and private lands. I'm again arguing for the preserve as being a unique opportunity to see what happens when we don't manipulate it. What happens in that carbon cycle. Hubbard Brook is an example of where they've been doing research for 50-some years, and they've been studying the carbon cycling, and we're learning a lot about carbon sequestration. And it's a hell but it is not going to stop climate change. But it's a really significant piece, but it can't stop climate change because it just, we can't do it fast enough or with enough volume to stop it. But it helps. Scott, are we about out of time here?
As long as you're
I-
answer that.
I'm ready to keep going. I'm keep going. Anybody else? If not, we stand adjourned and please.
Got one more.
Oh, one, okay, go ahead.
I'm just curious on your take on how the Climate Act could intervene with forest preserve management, whether that be through, like the agency's permitting processes and looking at UMPs, or it could be looking at, intervening more in things like hemlock woolly delta to protect forests. It could actually increase management. I was curious what your thoughts on how that does.
Well, that's the paradox. Is that how much are we going to preserve natural conditions and how much are we going to let processes roll? And that's, again, it's a conversation we need to have. We're never going to completely stop woolly adelgid. They've tried for over 15, 20 years coming from the Carolinas as it's moving north because climate change is allowing it to move north. We can't stop that process. We can try and slow it down. We can try and do what they did in the Carolinas, create these islands. Maybe it'll work, maybe it won't work, maybe it'll create these island communities. But those are the conversations we need to have. It can't be an all-out war against insects. It can't be an all-out covering the Adirondacks with pesticides. There's a lot of defoliators out there that have never been there before. And just go look at what's happening to trees and you'll see what I mean. We can't spray everything for everything that's coming. It isn't going to work. So we have to make very clear decisions about what we're going to intervene on, why we're doing it, and what we think is going to happen with it. Because we haven't been thinking that way in the past. We've been just going in and stopping everything we can stop, like forest fires. And that came back to bite us in the West. We suppressed all fires. Bad idea. That's why we've got catastrophic fires now. Besides the beetle-killed populations out there. And with that, I know you're going for your coats, so that tells me it's time to say goodnight. Thank you all.